Welcome to a spectacularly spooky evening at One Church. Some of you are like, this is weird. Embrace my life. It is weird. For those of you that haven't met me yet, or maybe don't recognize me because I'm a little green under the gills, my name is Angie von Slaughter. I'm the lead pastor of One Church. And I have to be honest, I've been saying I'm the lead pastor of One Church for probably about 4 months now. And the word pastor still feels a little foreign sometimes. Because for me, it is something that I've been doing in my life, but not professionally by vocation. And it's not until I meet somebody or I have a conversation with somebody and they remind me that I'm their pastor, that I have this moment of full-on gratitude for that label. That label that meant one thing to me has now completely morphed into something new. And it's because of this community. It's because of the power of love, the power of redemptive love. So I want to start off tonight by reading an excerpt of Ezekiel. And file this in the back of your brain, because we'll get to it later. There was a noise, a rattling sound. And then the bones came together, bone to bone. And I looked, and the tendons and flesh appeared on them, and skin covered them, but there was no breath in them. Sounds kind of like zombies, doesn't it? So tonight's message, of course, is titled The Wisdom of Zombies. And I'm going to scoot back a little if I can without falling on my butt. And if I do, just laugh. The inspiration for this message really came from a book that I was reading. I kind of am all over the map with my reading. And I read this book that was really interesting called Living with the Living Dead, The Wisdom of the Zombie Apocalypse. And it sounds bizarre, but I was really sparked to read this based on a podcast I listened to. And I thought, this is so strange. This guy named Greg Garrett, he's an author and a professor at Baylor University in Texas. And the thing that drew me in right away is here's this really well-spoken, really well-educated professor, and he's talking about zombies. And I'm thinking, this is interesting, but also weird. Of all the things you could be talking about, why are you talking about this? Let me pause. How many people are zombie fans in the room? Some are kind of, sort of, The Walking Dead? Okay, there you go. People are like, oh yeah, Walking Dead. And how many hate zombies and gore? You've got that too, yes. So you'll find yourself probably in this mix at some point or another. But the thing that I found interesting is reading the book, listening to the podcast, I kind of ended up going on a bunny trail of my own that really showed that this particular pop culture phenomenon is steeped in heavy symbolism and metaphor. And I am a sucker for symbolism and metaphor. I think it's why a lot of the biblical narratives are really coming to life for me, because you can see some of the historical context, but also some of these deep, rich, metaphorical meanings. So it may seem bizarre to have this message about the undead, but I think hidden in this narrative is something that I think makes sense for today, but also stretches back through history, even as you'll see into Hebrew scriptures. So to just give you a little bit of a backdrop on this, throughout history, during seasons of societal unrest, that could be war, famine, this type of divisiveness, there's narratives that we see that emerge in literature, film, theater, all kinds of different creative aspects of zombies and monsters. We see this emerge in literature. And they started to represent, if you started paying attention, they really started to represent the decay of humanity, or our worst fears. And so it really was society's looming fears packaged up in this entertaining monster figure. And it really represented what society was feeling, but in a way that was entertaining, which is, I think, the power of the creative arts, that in this time of hopelessness and corruption, you could be focusing on the problem, but in a different way. And so one of the first times we see something like this is in history during the Middle Ages. It's around the year 1424 with the Dance Macabre. And I have a picture that I want to put up there for you. It's a woodcut illustration by the German painter Michael Wohlgemuth. It's an interesting last name. Created in 1493. And the fascinating thing with this is you can kind of see it's, from far away you can see it's skeletons, but actually the ones on the end, especially the one with longer hair on your right side, if you get up close, you can actually kind of see it's more zombie-like than skeletal. It's sort of like the flesh is falling off, really, really morbid. And you started to see this was one of the first depictions of this popping up in history in this form. It was in different forms, but you start to see it depicted in this way as the dead rising up, basically escorting human beings of all walks of life to their grave. And they do it in a lively waltz. So people eventually put this to a play. So there's like little skeletons, la 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 la, let's go to your grave. And that became sort of this really weird narrative. And you're like, why on earth were people in 1493 interested in this? So here's another image that I want to show you. It's a detailed 18th century oil painting. It's also another depiction of the dance macabre, or also known as the dance of death. And if you're scratching your head why we're talking about this tonight, trust me, we'll connect some dots in a little bit. But for now, just entertain my art history nerd side that's fascinated with this. So you also see this depiction of this person in the center dying, and slowly but surely, all of these people that are dancing around and having fun, they too will meet their fate. And it doesn't take us long to figure out why this started emerging in this culture and in this time, because the Middle Ages were also known as the Dark Ages. Anyone have an idea of what was happening in that time? Plague. The plague. So you started to see outbreaks of the Black Plague, and then there was the 100 Years' War that left countless people dead. But the bubonic plague alone killed an estimated 75 million to 200 million people across Europe and Asia. That's insane. So these real-life horrors faced during this time, it really gave way to these playful images because people were faced with their mortality and they didn't know what to do with it. They didn't know what to do with it. So they thought, well, as most people do during this time, you start to express it in a medium of some form. So then you fast forward time, you see World War II, the Great Depression, and you hear stories and poems pop up of these zombie soldiers. You hear really interesting stories there. And then you have your first film around that time called White Zombie. There's irony in that for many reasons. This is the first time we see the undead depicted as mindless, unthinking creatures. So kind of we start to get now a little bit closer to the zombie we see now, this really mindless, not thinking correctly. And then in 1968, so we'll fast forward ahead even further, 1968, George A. Romero released, which is now a cult classic among horror fans. Anyone have any idea what this movie is? Did we say Night of the Living Dead? Yes. So any of you that grew up in this era know this. This was probably a big shock because there was nothing like this at this time. Romero, we have to thank for the term zombie as we know it now. And there's links to Haitian voodoo culture and all sorts of interesting stories with this word. But he's the one that really pushed it into our culture now. And he made it mainstream. He's also the one that we have to thank for the terrifying idea of a zombie apocalypse, which, mind you, the Pentagon actually has a structure in play for if we have a real-life zombie apocalypse, which I think is funny and really kind of fearful at the same time. So, again, this is 1968. Does anyone have any idea what was happening in 1968? The huge portion of us weren't even around, and then there's a portion that was. So what's that? Vietnam. We got a lot of people saying Vietnam. What's that? Civil rights. People are saying, nope, wrong history. Close? Yes. So you're getting an idea. We have Vietnam, civil rights. Also, during this time, it was super turbulent politically. A few years prior, JFK was assassinated. 1968, his brother, Senator Robert F. Kennedy, is assassinated. So you have a lot going on. In the U.S. alone, you have a lot going on. So it comes out in this film and in this culture, this idea. And society was literally, if you will, tearing itself apart. Literally tearing itself apart, not only with violence. We saw Martin Luther King get assassinated that year. There was a lot of things that happened during this time. And it challenged, and Romero took his creativity and decided to depict a story, which we just mindlessly go, oh, that's just garbage. It's just a zombie movie. And there's deep, hidden meaning, which is ironic because I think we do that with a lot of sacred texts. We're like, this is garbage, and there's deep, hidden meaning. But you sometimes have to peel back the layers. And then in 1981, Romero created another movie, which I see we have a spoof version of that in the audience tonight. It's a movie called Dawn of the Dead. I think we have Shaun of the Dead over here. How's it going, Shaun? And he confronted, which is yet another thing we see in zombies that they represent, is consumerism. They represent he confronted America's obsession with greed and needing things. Wanting even though we have more than enough. And he said, head on, this is what I'm seeing in the world. And so movies and shows continue to be made, and the majority of them, which is ironic, were made after 9/11, which was a huge time in our history of civil unrest, right? We saw a ton of fear. So The Walking Dead, World War Z, Zombieland, Warm Bodies, the list goes on. I gotta be honest, I hated zombie movies because I'm not into gore, and I'm a chicken. I get scared really easily. One night I was drawing, and my wife loves The Walking Dead. She was watching this show, and I just couldn't get over all the gross zombie sounds, and I thought, no, why do you watch this trash? And then I got into the story, and I went, oh, this is a good story. This is a really good story. And you start to realize, if you can get over that, you start to realize the show has nothing, honestly, at its core, it's not about zombies at all. It's about humanity. And you start to see this whole other side of it. And so when something deeply resonates and survives throughout time, when something is communicated, you get this sense that it's deeply universal. It's deeply universal. It's resonating on a deep core level, and maybe we don't understand why. For instance, Harry Potter. Why was Harry Potter so successful? It deeply, deeply resonates. And it wouldn't have resonated the same if he wouldn't have become the boy who lived. It wouldn't have resonated the same. But Harry Potter, something like that, it gives us a beacon of hope. It gives us strength. It gives us courage. It gives us something to be optimistic for in times of darkness. And I think right now we're facing another civil unrest. Would you say? And what's ironic and interesting is that the zombies are changing. You'll notice in culture, if anybody's paying attention, a lot of the zombie shows are becoming more human-like. They're starting to develop compassion, which is really weird. So Santa Clarita Diet, if anybody's watched that, it's now just silly, and you actually kind of think, oh, she's awesome. Who cares? That's fine. Go let her eat brains. That's okay. You almost get over that because you start to see a little bit of her humanity. And then iZombie, same thing. You have this funny, silly, likable character, and you start to realize, wait a minute, she's becoming more human. And so there's this humanness that's starting to weave itself in these stories. I am just pulling ideas out here, but I'm wondering if that's quite intentional. That we're starting to try to paint a different narrative of becoming and embracing more of our humanity. And so there's a couple things I want to talk about before we dive a little bit into our scripture before the service ends. Is zombies represent obviously a ton of things metaphorically, as I mentioned. They represent everything from consumerism, mindlessness, not being present, death, disease. They represent things that we find grotesque, even things in ourselves that we find grotesque. But there's two metaphors that I think are really prevalent for now. And one is zombies represent our darkest fears. While fear is a primitive tool, right? It helps keep us alive. It's what helps you know not to touch the hot stove or run into oncoming traffic. It tells you these things. It also, when it's unchecked, it can be debilitating. And instead, it can be contagious. And studies show it's one of the most contagious emotions. New studies show, I found this fascinating. Last year, there were these news studies that came out about fear being contagious. And we know, right, that animals smell fear, right? You've heard this before. This study is proving that humans smell fear. We just don't have it on the same heightened sense that maybe dogs or other mammals do. But what they did is a couple really bizarre tests. They took one group of people and had them run on a treadmill and get really, really sweaty. And they collected their sweat and harvested that, kept that. And then they had another group of people jump out of an airplane doing skydiving, collected their sweat. And then they had a group of people be the test subjects and smell the sweat. How many are like, sign me up for that job? Like, if I ever think my job, and I don't mean this one, because I do other work, if I ever think my job is terrible, I'm like, it could always be worse. You could be the sweat smeller. So what they did is they had these groups of people smell the sweat. It is weird. And they studied that the people that smelled the sweat that's off the treadmill, no response, same brain activity as usual. But the people that smelled the sweat that was coming off of the people that were freaked out jumping out of a plane, those people that smelled that, their amygdala lit up, like massive, and triggered a fear response, which is so weird. Which shows that on some level, we do actually have this physical response to fear that we can't see. And so it spreads, it's contagious. It spreads so easily from person to person. And it's like a virus that can't be contained. Do we see this a little bit in our world today? We know that anger, we see a ton right now. Anger is often linked to fear. And we see this so much today. What about in the news? How many times do you turn on the news and it's all roses and sunshine? Like never. Right? They're always showcasing the ones that evoke the high arousal emotions. Always those ones. So think fear, think anger, think anxiety. That's what they showcase. What about rants you see on Facebook? That can create a lot of anxiety, fear, tension. It becomes contagious, and you start to see it spread out of control. What about our political climate? We see that a lot. You see a lot of candidates use smear campaigns to kind of frighten you about this one, so you must choose this candidate. Battles over immigration, war on terrorism, mostly stemming from what? Fear. Fear. And those things aren't wrong. Fear isn't wrong. We then sink in and go, why do I feel that way? Let's confront that fear. Let's have that hard discussion. And so the narratives that we share about others and ourselves are highly, highly contagious. They can either be in a healing and positive way or a toxic way that consumes. And I think really the undead, they often symbolize something that's out of our control, right? We can't control it. If there was a zombie apocalypse, and I don't think any of us could do anything to stop it. How many of you think you would survive a zombie apocalypse? I got a few people right away. Aren't you a Marine? Air Force. Oh, that was a no-no. I realize getting the labels mixed up is a faux pas. I'm sure I would die right away. I'd be the girl in the horror movie that's like, and I fall and I get consumed. Why? Because I'm probably too attached to my phone or Google. I would be like, well, Google's not working. It's not telling me what to do. But zombies also represent, and here's really where I want to sink in, they represent not being fully alive. So many pop culture monster stories represent characters who have like these human-like qualities. Like zombies look like humans, except for obviously grossly disfigured, obviously not full of life. And They aren't quite alive. They're certainly not human. And the interesting thing about zombies is they want to consume the living, right? They want to consume the living, yet not embrace life itself. They want to consume life, but not be fully alive. And so they're undead. They're kind of stuck in this perpetual state of what I would call like purgatory. It's this in-between. Have you ever had seasons in life where you feel like that? Have you ever had seasons in life where you feel like you've been stuck on repeat on the film Groundhog's Day? Anybody? And sometimes life can get that way, and you are just, your alarm goes off, and you're like, another day. Maybe it starts off great. Another day. Awesome. And then as life goes on, it's repetitive. It's the same. It's mundane. And you start to kind of ask yourself, like, wait, what's my purpose? What am I even doing here? When's the last time I felt alive? When's the last time I felt just overjoyed? When's the last time I thought, I can't wait to be awake today. I can't wait to conquer the day. And I think that these stories that we hear, they get us to think about what it means to be human more than anything. And we see that in all of these narratives and all of these pop culture stories. And thank you for entertaining me, since it's a Halloween weekend, that we dive into this pop culture story. But it really asks us what it means to be human. And what I find so ironic is author and former pastor Rob Bell also says the same thing about the Bible. That the Bible is something that we can, it's stories, if you will, and narratives that we can see of what it means to be human, of what it means to be human and fully embrace our humanness. And this is a deep, profound wisdom that's found in ancient texts, as well as, obviously, we explored classic horror films, all wrestling with this human condition. And so a life lived without a sense of purpose, that's a life consumed, a life full of fear, and a life of hopelessness. That's certainly not living, is it? A life that feels hopeless, a life that feels like it's stuck on repeat, a life that's not fully invigorated and fully alive, that doesn't feel like living. And I have been there. I have been there countless times where I think, how did I get here? Where I just feel like a machine that's just working all the time. And when have I taken a moment to pause and recognize my own humanity, recognize my divinity, and connect with spirit? And so we then see that this is also found in the Hebrew Scriptures, as I read at the beginning. And some of you grew up with this story, so you might have heard this already, and some of you, this will be a brand new one. So no matter where you're at on the spectrum, I always like to approach it as if no one knows anything. Rob Bell said that once to me in a group. He said, talk to people as if no one knows, and you'll reach everyone. If you talk to everyone as if if you only talk to the smartest group of people in the room, then you'll miss a whole bunch of people. So if some of this is like, yeah, I get it, bear with me. I'd rather everyone get it than only some get it. Does that make sense? So the Hebrew Scriptures we see in this really strange book of Ezekiel. How many of you read this book? Of course Matt has. Matt, you read everything. I love it. I can always count. Matt, what about this book? This book contains the prophecies and visions spoken by the prophet Ezekiel, who lived also, ironically, in a time of deep societal upheaval, like major societal upheaval. So in this book, we read how Ezekiel lived in exile and captivity and in the city of Babylon. And not just him, along with about 10,000 other Jewish folks that were taken out of their land, and basically they were conquered. Their city was conquered and destroyed by King Nebuchadnezzar. And not only the city, but the temple, you see this whole turmoil happening. Everything's burnt to the ground. So everything Ezekiel had was home, was comfort, destroyed, burned to the ground. He's now displaced. The people that are with him, displaced. And he's feeling like, I'm sure what most people would be feeling like, hopeless. And Ezekiel was a prophet that started to receive visions, dreams. And I know for some people this might be hard to grasp, and some people totally get it because maybe that's happened to you. But he receives this vision, and I want to read part of it so that you can kind of understand what's happening here. It says in Ezekiel 37, so this is a vision that he receives. The hand of the Lord was on me, and he brought me out by the Spirit of the Lord and set me in the middle of a valley. It was full of bones. He led me back and forth among them, and I saw a great many bones on the floor of the valley, bones that were very dry. Which pause there. If we see they're very dry, we get a sense that they've been dead for quite some time, right? So we get a sense that this place is barren and lifeless and probably has been for quite some time. And he asked me, "Son of man, can these bones live?" And I replied, "Sovereign Lord, you alone know." Then he said to me, "Prophesy to these bones and say to them, dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says to these bones. I will make breath enter you, and you will come to life. I will attach tendons to you and make flesh come upon you and cover you with skin. I will put breath in you, and you will come to life. And then you will know that I am the Lord." So I prophesied, and as I was commanded, and I was prophesying, there was a noise, a rattling sound. And I really just want you to get this image of these pile of bones in this giant valley. They start rattling, and the bones came together, bone to bone. And I looked, and tendons and flesh appeared on them, and skin covered them, but there was no breath in them. So you're now talking about a zombie-like state. It's resurrected, but without that life, without that sense of vibrancy. And then he said to me, "Prophesy to the breath. Prophesy, Son of Man, and say it. This is what the sovereign Lord says." And follow me on this. This is a bizarre story, right? Very bizarre. But follow me on this. "Come, breath, from the four winds, and breathe into these slain that they may live." And so I prophesied as he commanded me, and the breath entered them. They came to life, stood to their feet, a vast army. Then he said to me, "Son of man, these bones are the people of Israel. They say, our bones are dried up and our hope is gone. We are cut off." So what a bizarre story. Did anyone follow that? You get this really strange and bizarre story, and Ezekiel has this vision, right, of this valley of these dry bones, full of dry human remains, which is so strange. And God speaks to him and explains that this is a metaphor. This is the state of the Israel nation. This is what it's like in their spirit. That being hopeless feels a lot like lifeless, dead, dry bones. And then this vision represents, on some level, for sure, the actual death that these people faced. Do we have a ghost? Some people are going, "What is that sound?" I told you, it's a spooky night. Who knows what will happen? So that this could have represented the actual death of these bones, but really more than anything, it's a metaphorical death. That's what God is focusing on. That's what God is focusing on in this moment, is they have suffered a metaphorical death. And then God tells Ezekiel that his spirit is going to bring his people back to life. And this wind comes, and it causes a stir, and then they stand up, the bones connect, and they stand up and they rise, and then skeletons start to form, and they get skin and tendon and flesh, and then a new human life is created. Now, I want to pause here. One thing that's super interesting to note is that in this very same story, it mirrors Genesis 2, where God creates human from dirt and divine breath. They mirror each other so much that you get this sense of this essence of life. And the word used, which I want to point out, the word used in both Greek and Hebrew sections of this scripture for spirit also means breath which it says there, the wind or breath, but some, and this is what I wanted to hone in on, some depictions mean the essence of life. The essence of life. And it's in this word that's used over and over and over and over again in Ezekiel 37 in the Valley of Dry Bones, the essence of life. These people had lost their essence of life. Do you feel we might be there in some sense as a country? That we've lost parts of, not all, but parts of our essence of life. What about for yourself personally? Let's scale it back on a very, very micro level. What about yourself? Are there parts that you feel like that you've buried that might need a bit of resurrection? What about your courage? What about your boldness? What about your creativity? Or your compassion? Or hope? Comic book writer and co-creator of The Walking Dead, Robert Kirkman said, "In a world where the dead walk, we have to learn how to live." That is really the whole premise of that story, but I think that's what we're being prompted to ask ourselves now. How do we then live? And I want to leave you with these beautiful words that struck me more than anything. And if you forget the entirety of the message and only take away resurrection and having hope, and this sentence, please bury it in your heart. Saint Irenaeus said these beautiful, beautiful words. "The glory of God is the human being fully alive." The human being fully alive. And I think sometimes we operate out of fear, and sometimes we operate out of consumerism, sometimes we operate out of scarcity and lack and hopelessness. And we're being invited into an abundant, fully alive life. And I think we're trying to figure it out in this day and age where the dead walk. We're trying to figure out how to revive, how to become human again. And so I'll leave you with two questions, and the worship team can come up at this time. I want to leave you with the questions that are on the screen and allow you time to reflect throughout your week. The first is, what makes you fully alive? And you might know right away. You might go, it's this. Or you might notice it throughout the weeks to follow. You'll do something that will bring you laughter, will bring you joy, will bring you passion, a spark, a divine spark. Take note of that. Take note of that. In a world where we're having hopelessness and divisiveness, we need more of those divine sparks. Take note of that. And what divine breath do you need to receive in your dry bones? So if you're feeling weary, if you're feeling tired, what is that you need? What is it that you are in need of? And hold that in your heart. Hold that in your heart and in your mind as we go throughout the week. I also want to commend you for listening to me for an entire, 35 minutes and trying to take me seriously, because I forget that I look like this. And I think that must be really difficult to listen to something serious. And my wife mentioned, you can't cry. If you cry, your makeup will fall off. And I thought, well, that does me no good because I'm such a crier. But I want to leave you with this. If you can take any of that, living a life fully alive is what I think that we're called to. Just being human. It's not something we have to work towards. It's not something we have to pray into. It's something we have to be. Something we have to be. And as a community, I think that we're being pushed and nudged into that even further. What makes one church fully alive? What makes you, as a human, fully alive? So think on this, and let's close that portion in a moment of prayer and reflection. Spirit, breath, the essence of life. We ask for more of that. And really, let me reframe that sentence. We ask for an awareness of that. We have all we need. We ask for an awareness of that. An awareness of breath, an awareness of new life. Where there's dry bones, make them come alive. Where we're weary, tired, fearful, help us reframe that. And we can step into justice and still hold on to hope. We can speak truth and be truth tellers and hold on to hope. We can blaze a new trail and not give in to the divisiveness we feel at this time and still hold on to hope. We ask for an awareness of that hope and that love that already surrounds us. Help us not get lost in the fear, not consumed. Help us not to consume each other with that, but to walk in the simple way of love. We ask these things in your name. Together we say, amen.